Hi, my name is Chris and I'm producing my videos with a camera that has a personality split disorder. And I'm specifically talking about the Canon EOS R, and today I want to list a couple reasons why I think it's a really good camera, but also things I don't like about this camera. And while I have a chance, I might also slip in a little bit of the wish list of the Canon EOS R5 that is supposed to come out later this year or mid this year, and I'm really interested in it. But now I want to talk about the EOS R specifically that I've been using for about 8 months at this point. And all of the videos that you see that have been published to this channel in that time frame have been with that camera. And of course, I'm currently talking into that camera, which means that some of the B-roll I'll probably have to do with the iPhone. So I'm going to cut in between those things a little bit. Now, the Canon EOS R is definitely a marvel of a camera, and it's a great starting point for a Canon to go into the mirrorless system, especially with the great lineup of lenses that is coming together with the RF mount. Now I'm shooting with the Canon RF35 1.8, which is actually also a macro lens. I also have the RF24 to 105 here, which is a f4 lens, and it's a great starter kit lens for this camera and the system. And all of the other lenses that are in that lineup are incredible as well. Me personally, I'm specifically also eyeing the 15 to 35 2.8, which I think would be amazing for an all-around YouTube and studio creation lens with a 2.8 as an aperture, but also the wide-angle lens that can capture much more of the scenery when you're traveling and those kind of things. However, for now, I'm working with these two lenses. At the beginning, when the camera came out, a lot of people have been very skeptical about the stats and the features that it provided. Now, I do think that those concerns are still very real, and we are all hoping that the R5 will finally change some of those things. But in the meantime, a lot of people have switched to the EOS R because it still is an incredible camera that can do a lot of things, especially for a certain type of creator. The photo quality is amazing, the megapixel count is enough for pretty much anything, and the RF lenses are incredible. But also the adapters work pretty much flawlessly, and taking all that into consideration, it's really incredible what we can do with this. And for myself specifically, considering that most of the things that I do are in 1080p, I am really happy with this camera in that quality range with the codecs that are available and some other features that I'm going to talk about toward the end of the video. However, I still want to mention a couple of the things that I found annoying throughout the use of this camera. Most of those things actually were pretty much apparent when I started using it at the start. Now it has been more and more integrated into my workflow and I make do. But I still want to give you a little bit of a rundown in terms of what you might run into when you're starting to use this camera. Some of these things are rather obvious, some of them are in the spec sheet, and some things are just things that I have run into when I worked with this camera and I was like, why is this not here? The first thing that I have on this list is actually something that I've never seen anyone talk about, and I just ran into it when I was using the camera, and that is that you cannot use the electronic level while also using IAF. I don't really understand why that is, and I find it quite annoying because I think that having the camera level is really helpful, but using IAF is also really helpful, and those two combined would be really cool, but sadly we cannot do that. The next thing is about the time-lapse mode of the camera, and there are a couple things that I don't really understand here. For one, you cannot shoot time-lapse mode with C-Lock enabled, and also you have to manually disable C-Lock. It's not just giving you an option, for example, start anyway or something like that. You really have to manually disable C-Lock, and then you can start using the time-lapse video shooting mode. You cannot use this time-lapse shooting mode on a custom function button. That is something that I don't really understand as well, because it would be really convenient to have one of those 3 custom function buttons set up as time-lapse shooting mode. And then I have a big one for myself, and that is that in time-lapse shooting mode, you can only shoot time-lapse videos which get rendered out by the camera. And I would really love to see an intervalometer inside of the camera that can shoot raw photos, because I think that that's something really powerful for portraiture, or especially self-portraiture, and also for group shots, and of course, time-lapse shooting. Now, I understand that there may be people out there that are using external intervalometers, and I will have a video on this in a couple of days from now, but I still think that it would be a really cool feature to have inside of the camera as a software, maybe an update, maybe in the next version of this camera, to just shoot raw photos in time-lapse mode as well. It would really help me out a lot. And then talking about custom shooting modes, why are there still 3? because now we are actually going into the shooting mode change settings with the mode button, and then we change the settings with a dial, but we still only get 3 custom function buttons, and I don't understand why. I would really appreciate having 6 maybe, or 5 or something like that, and also the ability to maybe even name them, because now actually they are no longer tied to a knob or a wheel that changes the mode, but it's actually just all software, and the screen real estate is definitely there to add a couple more shooting modes, and that would help me out a lot because oftentimes I have more than 3, and that would be really, really helpful. From the custom shooting mode count to the custom shooting mode button layout, I think that this is something that people are probably going to be torn on. I personally don't really like that the custom shooting modes also do change the button layouts. So when I want to have a button do something else, I have to potentially change it in up to 6 custom shooting modes. For example, if I want to change the AF on button to some other function. This is something that is quite tedious to do, and I do like the fact that you can change the button layout between photo and video mode, but for me personally, I use the same button layout for all 3 custom shooting modes, and I don't change on those. Additionally, some of the settings are actually not saved in the custom shooting modes, and some of the settings are, and it's not really something that is very obvious in some circumstances. But in general, of course, having custom shooting modes is great, but I would like to have more of them, and I would like to have the interface a bit more clear about what is going to be saved into them, and maybe in a function that I can actually update certain parts on all of them. The next thing is about the power and the USB-C port. And of course, there's something to actually praise, which is that it actually has a USB-C port. However, I don't really understand why it is not able to actually operate while being plugged into a USB-C power brick or wall outlet of some sort. This is something that I don't understand because laptops obviously can be charged while they're being used, and I think that that should be possible with this camera as well. Other cameras can do it, why not the EOS R? Which comes to a point that now you have to use something else, for example a dummy battery, if you want to have continuous shooting with the Canon EOS R, and that is also something that I will have a video about in the coming weeks. Generally speaking, I think USB-C is a really powerful connection. Having the camera run, record, and being powered by USB-C would be really nice because that would actually reduce the amount of gear that is needed to do something like that continuously. Then something that we already know about the EOS R5, it's something about the button layout and similar things. I really like that they are going back to the joystick at the top instead of the touch bar, which is kind of a fail, I think. And that's something that I actually really, really appreciate. Same thing goes for the click wheel behind around the set button, which is much, much more useful in my opinion, especially because it additionally gives you a way of changing one of the 3 main settings that always get changed between ISO, shutter speed, aperture, and those kind of things, instead of having the 4 buttons into different directions. So those 2 are really, really appreciated in the changes coming up in the next models. Something that a lot of people have mentioned over the year is that the ability to switch between movie and photo mode would be really cool if it were a hardware switch again. Instead of having to click the mode button and then the info button, and then you are actually back into the setting mode where you can actually choose between the different modes. I think that would be really amazing. At least making it simpler would be a really good start, but I don't necessarily think that that's going to change a whole lot because based on the photos that we've seen on the different devices, this is not something that is going to be updated or changed in the upcoming EOS R5. Something also about mode dials and switches is the on-off button of the EOS R, which I think is overly sized and mechanical. I don't really understand why that is basically a mode dial right there, which is not used for anything else but switching it on and off. It's a dial that is really big and it's actually really prone to dust and all kinds of other things and sand. So I don't really understand why that one thing had to be so big when everything else is kind of really nicely laid out. And the last thing on this list that I want to mention in terms of the negative or the lacking category is that it does not have the second SD card slot. However, I have a different stance on this, and that is that I don't think that it's that much of a huge deal. I get that there are certain professions that need that second slot, or at least they want it for peace of mind. Personally, I've never had an SD card fail, and on top of that, if you consider in terms of other gear, you have the RED cameras, you have other big cinema cameras, they don't have second card slots. And I actually think that yes, it is useful, but it's not a reason not to buy this camera if you are considering it. Personally, I don't miss it, and I would not pay extra to have a second card slot. But your opinion may differ, and that's okay. And now let's talk about a couple more things that are more on the split personality side, especially talking about things that are considered very much pro and then at the same time it is lacking at the same category. The first thing I have about that is C-Log. It's incredible that we have it in this small package, and especially paired with an external recorder, it's really powerful with a 4:2 10-bit recording. However, we lose the auto ISO setting in C-Log. And I don't understand why, because there are definitely cameras from Canon out there that can do that. They have C-Log and they have auto ISO. I understand that this may not be something that a lot of people want, and there are those people that want to have the manual control for everything, and they're pretty much disgusted by anyone who wants to have anything auto. But personally, I think that it would be really, really handy to have auto ISO in C-Log, specifically when vlogging or doing something like that. Because right now I'm only able to actually do everything manual in C-Log, and that is quite annoying to me, especially when out and about by myself alone and I might want to just have something automatic for peace of mind. Another really pro thing about this camera is that it actually came with a cable stabilizer for the HDMI and USB port, as well as audio ports and such things. Though the issue with this cable stabilizer, and I think that that may be something that is actually with pretty much any cable stabilizer that is out there for cameras, is that you really have to find the right cable that fits into that thing. I actually had to basically cut open one of my cables to be able to kind of squeeze it in there with a little bit of tape. The other thing that is also a kind of downside in this setup is that when I use the cable stabilizer, I actually can no longer use the flip out screen, because then the cable stabilizer actually is in the way. So I only get about a little more than 90 degrees. So it's really hard to see myself when I'm using that setup. But I really like that they went that far to actually include that in the package. The next one is that this camera has incredible codecs and powerful recording quality. This is actually because of the all-I codec as well as the high bitrate that the camera processes. And this is a difference that a lot of the smaller cameras or other cameras don't provide. And that is something that I really like about this camera. And even more powerful is if you pair all of that power with an external recorder, and also of course with C-Log. All of these things are quite powerful and make even the 720p 120 frames per second actually useful in a 1080p timeline. Personally, I actually use the 60 fps 1080p more than the 120 720 without autofocus. However, I still think that it's really powerful that they included it. Of course, I hope that this would be something that changes in the R5, maybe 120 in 4K even, maybe 120 in full frame 1080p. We don't really know. But overall, having C-Log with an external recorder at 10-bit 422, internally with 8-bit 422, 1080p in full frame, and 4K with the 1.8, almost 1.8 crop, all of that is a really cool package. At the same time, of course, there's a way of improving it to go full frame 4K and similar things. A couple more really good things about this camera that I like is that you have a lot of customizability, even though I have a couple complaints on that regard. Because I mentioned we actually don't have auto ISO and C-Log. However, in other modes, we actually have quite powerful auto ISO where you can actually decide what to focus on. So the camera actually knows what setting it should prefer, if it should stick to 1/50th of a second, or if it should go for a higher shutter speed instead of higher ISO and those kind of things. So it's really powerful in that regard, and I really like that. Then of course we have the dual pixel autofocus, which works wonders, and I really, really like that compared to the camera that I was using before, the Canon, and I'm really happy that I actually changed back to the Canon EOS system. And last but not least, we have the battery life, which is incredible for being that package that it is. The batteries are really powerful, and this camera actually uses the juice quite powerfully as well. And you can even record long form content, and I think up to 2 hours is something that is really possible with this camera and setup and everything. Overall, looking at this list, I think that it's still an incredible camera, even though there are these little corners that would be able to improve a lot. And I also think that camera manufacturers could actually put more into the firmware updates of these cameras, making them more long-living. Of course, I understand that the reason why they don't do that is because they want to sell more cameras, but for me as a consumer, it would be really nice if sometimes certain features could be added along the lines. For example, having something like the custom shooting mode edition for more modes available, or the intervalometer for raw photo taking. All of those things could be changed with software, and those things are probably nothing that are really depending on higher hardware, so why not update the firmware of something that is already out there, making it more valuable and also helping your customer base. However, the track record of Canon is not necessarily showing us that they're going to do that, but instead they're going to develop new cameras and bring those out, and we are all going to buy them because they have something that the previous version didn't have. Now, looking through this list and thinking about what I have done with this camera in the last almost year, I'm really happy with it overall. Of course, there are certain quirks, but those are apparent with pretty much any other camera out there as well. And having this baseline, having this first version of a mirrorless camera actually makes me very hopeful looking into the future of Canon with the EOS R5. But really, the question is how many of the things that I personally dislike or other people dislike are going to be fixed in the EOS R5? What is going to be included in that package, and what are we going to get? Of course, we already know that it's going to shoot 8K in some sort of way because they have made that announcement, and I'm really curious how that's going to work out, because most certainly that is going to be full frame 8K, because otherwise the pixel count would be much higher than that one that is already being discussed around the 40 megapixel mark. So that's going to be incredible. The next questions, however, for myself are, what about full frame 4K? What about full frame 120 frames per second in some sort of fashion? What about autofocus in all of those shooting modes? And so on. I personally would really like to see a 60 frames per second full frame autofocus driven 4K as well as 1080p. Those two modes are something that I would really like to see. And if we have a 120 4K in a cropped mode, that would be something that is already interesting as well. Of course, I personally would prefer having autofocus in all of those modes, but of course with the 1DX Mark III already on the market, we have already seen that certain modes in that camera are cropped in and without autofocus, especially in the high frame rate modes. And I do think that those are drawbacks that we'll have to live with as long as we're getting the 4K full frame in the 24 frames a second, 60 frames a second, potentially 120. Those things would be really powerful, and I would greatly appreciate if those are coming out, and I'm probably going to invest in that camera as soon as it hits the market. A couple more things we've already seen about this camera as well are the backside changes in terms of button layout. The little click wheel around the set button is something that I really appreciate, because with the cameras that I actually used first from Canon, that was the 30D, the 40D, as well as the 5D Mark II, those cameras all had the wheel around the set button on the backside, and that wheel actually made it really useful because you could change aperture, shutter speed, and ISO with wheels around that camera, and that is something that I'm really looking forward to in the EOS R5 as well. And of course the touch bar is gone and the joystick is back, and that is something that you already probably know I will appreciate. I'm really happy that I sold all my Sony cameras and lenses when I switched back to this camera system. And actually I am really happy that I switched back to the system after all, because when I started around 10-15 years ago with cameras, with DSLRs, I was already in the market for the Canon lineup. And then I started using it for video productions on my baking show that I did with a friend. And then came the mirrorless systems and the smaller bodies from Sony, and that was really intriguing. However, now that I'm back on the system, I'm actually quite happy in terms of everything that I like about that. And actually there's a video that you can watch about when I switched to the Canon EOS R from the Sonys, and there you actually can see how I was thinking about the switch at the time as it happened, so you can have a little bit of a view into that there. I'm really excited to see what Canon will bring to us with this new mirrorless system, the R5, and also looking into the future of the R system in general. Overall, I think the Canon EOS R was a grand entrance into the mirrorless market for Canon. The RF lineup of lenses is incredible, and I'm really looking forward where it's going to take us, and the R5 looks very promising. I hope this was an interesting video for you in general. If you have any other questions about the Canon EOS R that you want to have answered, maybe I can do that. So you leave your questions in the comment section down below. If you like the video, give it a like. If you want to learn more about the Canon EOS R, certain accessories, as well as the using of the unlimited battery, how I use this camera with external monitors, live streaming, as well as the intervalometer, those things are going to be covered in the coming weeks on this channel, so subscribe for more of those things, and I will see you in the next video. Ciao, ciao.